And I'd like to take a few minutes this afternoon to talk about the tax provisions in the agreement before us. And I want to start by making sure that people understand what this is really all about. Mr. President, this is the biggest bipartisan package that provides real tax relief for working families in literally decades. And it is the biggest anti-poverty program the Congress has moved forward in decades. So to be able to do all of this for working families and helping millions of Americans find their way out of poverty is, in my view, something particularly important. The largest bipartisan tax agreement in 15 years. And I want to spend just a few minutes describing how this came together, why it's such an important piece of legislation, and what it means for the cause of tax reform. Hundreds of thousands of Oregonians and millions of families across the land count on the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit to make ends meet. And more than 100,000 Oregon students and millions of students nationwide count on the American Opportunity Tax Credit to help them pay for college. These are concerns Senator Merkley and I heard directly from students at the roundtables that we held recently at the University of Oregon and at Southern Oregon University. And in my view, they are bedrock priorities for working families when it comes to taxes. Starting more than a year ago, all of my Democratic colleagues on the Finance Committee came together around the principle that when the Congress took up the temporary tax cuts known as extenders, these vital individual tax incentives for working families would be our special priority. If our colleagues on the other side insisted on making certain business-related tax breaks permanent, we were going to make clear at every single opportunity that the tax cuts for working families and students would have to be made permanent as well. Now, back in 2009, when these working family tax cuts were actually expanded, there were some members here in the Senate who said they would never allow them to become permanent. In effect, what they said, Mr. President, is that working families would get a little bit of relief back then in 2009, but that would be it. That would be it for those working families. And we said that's not good enough. We said that without the certainty of permanent extensions, too many families across this country would be thrown into the dark as the provisions expired over and over again. 130 groups, advocates for those who walk an economic tightrope, balancing their food against their fuel and their fuel against their medical care. Over 130 groups who advocate for those working families wrote a letter urging lawmakers to make the working family credits permanent. They said, don't keep those families guessing about their taxes. Give them certainty and assistance on a permanent basis. That's what this package does, Mr. President. There's a new measure of certainty and predictability when it comes to taxes. The last tax bill in America passed just over a year ago. It had the shelf life shorter than a carton of eggs. What we're doing with this bill is providing an alternative with real certainty and predictability on a permanent basis. I see my colleague here, Senator Brown, who has done yeoman work, advocating for working families and their kids. I so appreciate his leadership, and suffice it to say what we just heard from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities is that 16 million Americans, including 8 million children, will be lifted from the depths of poverty or out of poverty altogether in 2018 and beyond because of this legislation.
Senator, yield for one moment.
I would be happy to yield.
Thanks. I thank the ranking member of the Finance Committee, the former chairman of the Finance Committee. About a year ago, when it wasn't so clear that it wasn't so clear at all that the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has been the most effective, according to President Reagan and most presidents of both parties since, has been the most effective tool to fight poverty in recent memory. I mean, I would also say Social Security and Medicare, of course. But what the Earned Income Tax Credit coupled with the Child Tax Credit has done is reward work, help people making $9, $10, $12 an hour, sometimes working 2 jobs, help lift them out of poverty because they simply don't make enough money to be able to live a decent standard of living if they're making $9 an hour. And what Senator Wyden has done, working with a number of us, is when it wasn't at all clear the Earned Income Tax Credit wouldn't expire in the next couple of years, is negotiate and basically say, sure, we want to do these business tax credits or business tax deductions because we think this will help our country grow, but we shouldn't give tax breaks to large businesses and leave behind workers. And that's really what this coalition did, was pretty much say to people here that haven't always thought much about low-income people, frankly, we don't, we work around here. If you don't go out of your way to meet low-income people and you don't talk to them about their lives, you get out in the cafeteria, those people are making way too little money. People here don't know their names, all of that. But when you really think about this, it makes a huge difference in people's lives. And I just want to thank Senator Wyden for his role in helping put that coalition together.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. President, before he leaves the floor, I want to thank my colleague from Ohio whose advocacy, his constant tenacity, coming back again and again and again to talk about what this means for those families walking on what I call an economic tightrope. We wouldn't be here without that advocacy. And I just learned from some of the experts in the field that altogether 50 million Americans are going to benefit from the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit being made permanent. That is real relief, Mr. President, on a permanent basis. And on a permanent basis, students would be able to count on the American Opportunity Tax Credit to cover up to $10,000 of a 4-year college education. That's an awful lot of money they are not going to have to borrow. Now, there are other important highlights in the package. Permanent help for the commuter, permanent assistance for low-income housing, permanent tax breaks to encourage charitable giving. That's a huge lifeline for places like the Oregon Food Bank. That's a place where I was just a few days ago, Mr. President. I saw all those young people, all those volunteers last Saturday morning. They were all pitching in, packing the fruit for the families that would enjoy those fruit baskets. So they do incredible work to combat hunger, and I saw it just a few days ago. And there'd be 5 years of assistance for job seekers, including veterans, the long-term unemployed, and people with disabilities. 5 years of aid to hard-hit communities with the New Market Tax Credit. 5 years of certainty for solar and wind energy. This is especially important. We have seen the extraordinary interest in climate change. You can debate whether or not you think that there is a serious problem. I certainly do, based on what the numbers from the scientists at NOAA, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, tell us. It's a serious, serious problem. And now we've got permanent certainty, 5 years of certainty for solar and wind energy, which I think is going to make an extraordinary difference in renewable energy. Now, here's what the math of this package looks like. 40% of the tax breaks go to families and individuals. That is a huge improvement over the typical math with these tax breaks. When Congress just passes the same old set of tax extenders as it's done for years, only 20% goes to families and individuals. So this package doubles the percentage of families that would benefit as it relates to this particular package. Now, there are clearly a number of business-related tax cuts. And by the way, I think many of those make a great deal of sense as well. The permanent tax break for research and development. And because of the good work of our colleague from Delaware, Senator Coons, for the first time it's going to be available on a widespread basis to small business and startups. It's in there. And I would say the President of the Senate, because I've been to his state, this is going to be a real booster shot for America's innovative economy. Permanent small business expensing is going to help a lot of employers invest, grow, and create new high-wage, high-skilled jobs for American workers. When I drive, for example, through rural Oregon, I have town meetings at every county every year, and I drive through rural Oregon. You go out and you see all those little businesses that in effect sell farm implement, equipment. Last year, they were trying to figure out what was going to happen with respect to the expensing rules, and then they saw it only lasted, a few weeks. Now we've got permanent small business expensing. That's going to help small employers in rural areas. Research and development credits that are permanent will help small employers in urban and rural areas, and a lot of times they'll help employers pay wages for employees at those new innovation-related programs. And I think that those tax breaks that I've just mentioned, like expensing for small business and permanent research and development breaks, ought to be the kind of thing that both Democrats and Republicans would approve of. Now, I want to take just a few minutes, Mr. President, and talk about the impact of this legislation on tax reform. And I will tell you that my wife always says, don't describe the federal tax code in your typical way because you just frighten the children. But the reality is the American tax code overall is just a rotting economic carcass. It's infected with loopholes and inefficiencies. Now we've got this inversion virus mutating and growing. This is really a mess of a system. What this legislation does, particularly by making permanent the breaks for working families and the smart policies that encourage businesses and innovation and economic growth in our community through research and development and realistic write-offs, what this is going to do is, in effect, clear the deck for tax reform. This lays the opportunity out by giving breathing room to the cause of bipartisan tax reform, something I'm particularly interested in, because our colleague from Indiana, Senator Coates, and I have written a bipartisan tax reform bill, a bipartisan comprehensive tax reform bill. What this legislation does in terms of creating breathing room for tax reform is it breaks the chain of just extending these tax extenders every 2 years. And what it means is that we have some predictability and some certainty and some breathing room in order to lay out a bipartisan, comprehensive tax reform effort. And by the way, Mr. President, beyond the fact that this inversion virus is something that can't be ignored any longer, that alone is an indication that the Congress cannot duck the need to reform the tax code, comprehensively. Look at those in key positions here in the Congress who've made it clear that they want bipartisan tax reform. Democrats and Republicans. Chairman Brady, for example, Chairman Hatch, myself, a number of colleagues on both sides of the aisle have said they want to do comprehensive tax reform and want to, as I've described it, break the chain of every year or every 2 years, just once again passing these extenders. We're not the extenders Congress. I don't want to have us back every 2 years just doing the same old, same old. We can do a lot better. And this time, we have at least laid the foundation for real tax reform. I want to thank a number of my colleagues, in particular, Chairman Hatch, our committee members on both sides of the aisle, the two leaders, Leader Reid and Leader McConnell, for their efforts. We had an awful lot of dedicated staff people working on this issue. Our diligent tax counsel is here, Todd Metcalf. I want to thank him for his great work. Our terrific staff director, Josh Shankman, our chief counsel, Mike Evans, the tax team, Ryan Abraham, Bobby Andrus, Chris Arneson, Adam Carasso, Danielle Deraney, Karen Getz, Rob Jones, Eric Slack, Tiffany Smith, and Todd Wooten. All of them have worked long, long hours to get us up to this point. And I also want to commend Liz Jarenko and Juan Machado of our health staff, because they joined a very good leadership team as well in these efforts. Senator Reid's chief tax aide, Ellen Danefsky, Chairman Hatch and his staff, led by Chris Campbell, an Oregonian, Mark Prater, and Jay Khosla, Brendan Dunn with Senator McConnell's office, George Callis, and Chairman Brady's staff. All of them came together to help us put together this effort. And I believe now, Mr. President, that there is really an opportunity to use this bill as a springboard to real tax reform. I've written 2 bipartisan tax reform bills over the years, the first with our former colleague from New Hampshire, Judd Gregg, the second with our current colleague, Senator Coates, the distinguished senator from Indiana. And I know my wife would always say, I keep hearing about these tax reform bills, dear. Write me when something actually happens. Well, I tell you, I think now the combination of this inversion virus, which really, if it keeps growing, is going to hollow out America's tax system, plus the fact that we have brought some certainty and predictability to the tax code, added some very sensible provisions in a permanent way. This really gives us an opportunity now. The table is set for real tax reform, and that is not something we've had before. And I just want to close by way of saying that I am so honored to represent Oregon in the United States Senate. I was director of the Senior Citizens, the Great Panthers, for about 7 years before I came to the Congress. So I've had a lot of exciting moments in my time in public service. But to be part of this bipartisan legislative effort that provides the biggest tax cut for working families and the biggest anti-poverty plan Congress has moved forward in decades is particularly thrilling. I thank all of my colleagues and their staff who've done so much to make this possible. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.